and then we will have a kind of a wrap up and a kind of commitments session. So the first thing I would say is we did ask the working group leads to kind of share a similar format across. So what we're going to share is, like, you all have a specific theme. So what we'd like to hear from you is, with respect to that theme, were there ideas around research, info needs, case studies, tools, etc., if you have that, and also commitments, like to the future, meaning what would be the role of this working group moving forward, individual actions, or institutional actions to generate it. I should also add that, if possible, if you're a working group lead or you've been asked to present on behalf of the working group, if you could just give us a bit of a flavour of your discussions, that would help as well. Not massive, not a big presentation, again, about the topic, but just a flavour of the key issues that you spent significant time discussing. Yeah. So some people have sent me a couple of slides. Others, I'm just assuming you are ready. I was going to ask if Nora's group could come first. And is that okay with you? Yeah. Do you have any presentation or anything?
We have a slide.
Yes.
Did you? Okay, so give me, and I will put on my thing.
First, I will just give a summary.
Exactly. So let me find the slides.
That would be for you. Our group discussed advocacy, social mobilization, and behavior change communication, which of the three. So we divided the group into four small working groups, and each group worked on a country case study that is no smoking. The case study actually described the situation in the country, about the smoking incidents, government regulations, private sector involvement, tobacco industry, etc., etc. And they were asked to answer three questions. Who are the target audiences, based on what we call the socio-ecological model of the consumer, the influencing factors, and then identifying which strategy or which mix of strategies would be relevant and appropriate, considering that they are given $5 million to implement a campaign within a 5-year period. So they had to make certain choices, considering the resources available, the time frame, and then the context. So the groups did very well, and I think they came up with a very good mix of strategies. Basically, I think one theme that came out is the prioritizing, focusing first. Is Sean here? Focusing on the groups that would be easier to change. And so based on that, also trying to change legislation, so advocacy to change legislation. So they were very, I think it came out very well, but there was already an understanding of how to identify a strategy based on the analysis of the situation and the context. So does anybody want to add anything more from our group? Anything? This is just a summary. So and then today we discussed the questions, and I'll ask Wonder will present.
Thank you, Nora. So and then this morning, if I click.
To the right, yeah. Is it working?
Maybe you explain first how it works.
Okay. Yes, maybe stand here, but it was mine.
So I keep it very simple. We have this morning a couple of topics we discussed, and actually these are the key takeaways. So what we all see now, there's a vast amount of research available, but it's not synchronized. And synchronized meaning that people ask different questions, and then you get, of course, different outputs, so you can't compare results. Also, we have a lot of duplication of research, so we see a lot of research among consumers in different countries, but every NGO wants to do more or less the same stuff, and you're asking it over and over again. So what we have some suggestions there. So first, and I think it was a great example on HIV was mentioned by, I think, somebody from the UN, that you need to do research on research, or meta-research. So each research should be classified, and we see how relevant each research is on which topic. Now, some of that research has been done. Actually, we did last year a study for WWF, and we looked at all the different researches being done on ivory in China. So we reviewed more than 20 research done on ivory, and you can find a lot of commonalities in that. And that research is available. And making that research available, accessible and searchable, to my knowledge, there's a lot more available than you may think. I think also sometimes people are not looking into it. So if you look to the traffic website, there's a toolkit there, there's a lot of research on there. If you go to USA website or the WWF website, there's a lot of information available. So it's sometimes assumed that it's not accessible, but actually quite often it is. So that's one of the things that came out of our group too. Search through those websites of major NGOs particularly, and there is a lot of research available. But what we've not done in general is classifying it, seeing how good it is or what is relevant. Then also it was said make concept test results available and shareable to save costs. I'm less familiar whether this is available or not, but definitely every time when you do a concept test on which celebrity works, or which campaign works, and there's so many campaigns going on, making sure it becomes somewhere available, at least on the website, so people can see it and share it with this kind of symposia here. And then lastly, we said and it was actually discussed at the end of the session today, also in the Consumers Research Work Group, we should actually have one big multi-client study with measuring the same thing for all NGOs. If that were being paid by all NGOs, apart from different NGOs paying for their own research, it would make the above a lot easier, it would have more commonality, it would be cheaper, and actually it would be available for everyone. So I think we should set up, call it in the research terminology, a multi-client or a syndicated survey. Then, oh wait. Any questions on it maybe before I go to the website? Because, yes, the next slide. You want to click or you want to talk to the mic?
I mean, I think the point about multi-client studies is really good. I think we're also doing something similar already for the pangolin work in China. There's been coordination across several organisations all interested in the latest for pangolins. So it's great to have that proof that this can happen. Quite excited about the opportunities for other taxa.
Yes. Okay, so that's, any other questions, remarks? All right. Okay, then we said about the toolkits. Now there's a lot of toolkits available, that's another thing. I think in reality a lot of organizations are doing the same thing. You can have a whole list of toolkits available across our organizations here. So again, rather than, I would suggest to make a new toolkit, see what's available, collate it, use it, and see what you can use for your own organizations. Again, maybe because I'm most familiar with it, Traffic has a whole extensive toolkit on many different ways. So you can log in there and have it available. So you can see here the examples of availability. It's how to develop toolkits on SBCC, about training, about procedures, on fact sheets, on communication materials. There is an awful lot available. So let's not think that we need to do a lot of things again. Often we can just use what's there. But a lot of organizations, of course, like to start their own toolkit, perhaps their own communication material. Let's use it rather than develop something new. And in there, and I think that's the example why we hear better coordination. So a comprehensive scope of work should be available and find consensus to select NGOs to lead coordination. Now, I gave an example in our work group for WWF in traffic, which they did in China and Beijing earlier this year, and then with USA we did it in June again in China. All the NGOs came together and we used research data to see actually what are the main issues in China. Now what we saw, that ivory is increasingly bought in the second tier, in the third tier city. So the first tier, for those of you who are less familiar, are Shanghai, Beijing, and Shanghai, Guangzhou. And all NGOs are doing programs there because they know those cities best. In that work group, we decided actually that WildAid would concentrate on the second tier and the third tier cities rather than the first tier cities. Yeah, so because of division of work, we can become a lot more efficient. Of course, there has to be kind of consensus who is leading the coordination, because every NGO likes to do their own thing. They have their own donors, they have their own sponsors. But there was a kind of consensus that they would be the easiest one to lead this coalition, and they're doing it to an increasing extent. NGO Marketplace, Society of Wildlife, and then one thing I'm personally less familiar with, but I think Sean brought it up. There will be a big convention in China in 2020, and we need to raise the illegal wildlife trade now there, to making sure we are strategic in the coming years to be high on the agenda. Lastly, oh yeah, before I go there, any questions or remarks on this? Maybe I go too fast or too slow. Okay. So, and then of course, it's a very important thing too, and it's more, call it marketing, call it consumer research. We have to segment our communication. Yeah? People are motivated by different messaging, and you have to make sure that when you do a messaging, some people are motivated or demotivated, deterred by the ban on ivory. Other people are deterred by wildlife, conservation issues, and other people are because they think it's important for sustainability in general in the future. So you have to think about what's the right audience, of which message fits with which audience. Online training platforms, we need to look more into that. We also discussed, and that's a very complicated one, a lot of wildlife is being used in traditional Chinese medicine, and can substitutes replace that? Well, it's a very difficult one, but before you go into that discussion or that idea, it should be extensively researched whether that's a great idea. Because before you have a substitution, you can even drive demand for the real stuff more than reusing it. And then we looked at also at pressure on wildlife reduction. It's 10 cents with WeChat and other platforms. They recruit key opinion leaders to change mindset of audiences. In Baidu is a good example. If you search for ivory, you get immediately a pop-up to say that ivory is illegal in China to buy. So very important to collaborate with the big Chinese technology companies. And I think these were the key takeaways from our group. Any other questions?
Thank you. Any other questions for the group, or the group wants to add? I can see someone over there. Are you from the group or you're from a different group?
I just wanted to touch a little bit about the two kids that you mentioned. One sector is that I've been working a lot with the journalists, and they're also, when it comes to like a wildlife trafficking or wildlife crime, they're also like asking for suggestion, because most of the time when they do the report, they just stop at when there's a press conference about the seizures, and then no digging further. And they also get lost a little bit, and they keep asking me, is there any a media toolkits for the journalists if they want to report about a wildlife crime? What are the aspect of the wildlife crime that they should look into? And when we are talking about the demand, there's not so many of them really understand or look into this. Yeah, that might be something that we can consider as a team.
Okay, thank you. I have Alex's hand. Is it linked?
Okay. So just to very much agree with the point made about having sort of a shared approach to some of this monitoring, apart from the kind of, for the, in some ways the efficiency savings, but also so that we're tracking the same things, so we're building on each other's research. This is a kind of an open question for the kind of the CWC website of, we've talked about kind of sharing data. I wonder if making sure that there's also opportunities and an obligation that when you're sharing that data, you're sharing the method by which you collected it. Especially if it's self-report survey data, having a better sense of what questions you specifically asked, how, where, to whom, I think will make sure that the data is a lot richer. That might also be functionality you already have, but once we start to get that further, it means that moving to these kind of shared approaches that you're describing we can do so from a position of kind of strength in the sense that we see what's already out there, where there already are kind of overlaps.
Okay, I saw someone else's hand.
Hi, I just wanted to answer the earlier comment or question about helping journalists. So I'm from WWF Malaysia. So when I was based in one of the programs we have in Sabah and Borneo, one of the things we have done is to do an environmental journalism workshop for university students who are studying journalism, studying mass comms, and also rookie reporters. And we actually did like field trips for them where we bring them to certain field sites and show them what the issues are and ask them to come back and write an article based on the issues that we've shown. So that's number one. Number two, also we have done sort of like a handbook where we actually translated and interpreted the common technical terms that we use. Because one of the feedback that we got from that environmental writing workshop was that a lot of them were not familiar with science articles, and they find it very hard to digest scientific findings. So we hope that the manual would really help them to actually, break the technical terms into easily to understand, so that they'll be able to write better. So probably that would be helpful for you guys as well.
Is that in English, that?
English and Malay.
Okay, thank you for that information. Any others? Thank you. Okay, I'd like to invite the group that was talking about the attitude-action gap. Value-action gap. Attitude to action. Yeah, I do.
Okay, I've got some assistants. So Chitra, May, and Zara, please. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So we were looking at the value action gap or attitude action gap, which I kind of outlined very briefly yesterday. So what we did, Toby worked through initially a kind of theoretical process from your values, your attitudes, where the leaks occur, you may remember that word yesterday, and he actually gave the description of a decision to move to cycling, from out of your car and into cycling. So it was an environmental perspective. We then said to the group, please choose a wildlife species or product that you would like to work on. And so we've got the three representatives of our groups who are going to give you a description of basically what we covered over the last couple of days, and then we'll talk to some of the research results that we had as well. So who'd like to go first?
Hello everyone. So for my group, we decided on shark fin demand reduction, and specifically at weddings. The reason why we chose weddings is because, at least in Malaysia, 85% of shark fin consumption is actually happening at weddings. So it really makes sense to tackle that. And this was mainly covered by both the Malaysian and Thai office, because we have similar campaigns going on for shark fin soup. So naturally, our target audience were the wedding couples and the family, the restaurants that's serving this shark fin soup, and also the wedding planners. So going back to the leaks that Toby mentioned yesterday, so the first one was about resistance to change in changing your values and beliefs and attitude. And the way we mapped it out was like, the first thing that we all said was that shark fin soup is not illegal. So it naturally, presents a mindset that, it's totally okay to eat it. Next was the whole idea around symbolisms of shark fin soup. So it's seen as being an auspicious dish. It's a status symbol, naturally, everyone knows that. It's also tradition, and in the Asian culture, tradition is very important. We are rooted in tradition, so it's naturally seen as a very, very important symbolism. Of course, there's also the element of expectation. So as a host, there is a huge expectation that I need to serve this, because my guest wants to see it. It's a way of me respecting my guest. If I don't serve it, I'm being cheap. And of course, no wastage. So the perception that, all these videos we've had about shark fin soup is about the cruelty element that sharks are being fed and thrown back to sea. So now the argument is that's not true. We eat the whole fish. I mean, we eat the meat, we take the skin, there's no wastage. So what's the big deal, right? So that's the main resistance change in terms of changing people's values. And then when we think about how does that then lead to intentions and the leakage that leads to intentions, then it's about the whole idea about what can one person make a difference. So when we ran the campaign, we asked people to make pledges to sign up their name to say that we will not consume shark fin soup. They said, oh yeah, we will sign the pledge, but really what difference does it make? I mean, I'm just one person. I mean, and we also had another group of people say, yeah, we'll sign the pledge, but people serve it, we'll still eat it. And finally, about how then does intention translate to action? And here, the two issues that we covered was that people can't say no because the social norm is for everyone to eat it. So you don't want to be the one person who's going to say no and push the soup away. And of course, at the menu itself, the shark fin soup is already part of the menu, so you need to opt out if you don't want fins in your wedding, and it's much more expensive, and the restaurants make it so much more difficult to do that. They're not really happy about you taking the fins out of the menu because that's the biggest profit margin in a wedding banquet for the restaurants. So these were the very clear leakages that we mapped out. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. And we took a very clear value action gap in one particular bit of that, which was people who are trying to have weddings without shark fin. So it's very difficult for them not to, because the restaurateur pushes them, their parents push them because of the social norms. So the gap there, for those people who had the kind of value we were after, and their ability to implement that was really, really clear. So that was actually, it was a really interesting one, and we got into some depth. Okay, Dara, do you want to talk about the tiger amulet?
Thank you. In our group, we'll look at the tiger amulet, which is the case for Thailand. Even if the consumer of the tiger amulet quite small, just like 1%, this is based on USAID Wildlife Asia research, 1% of Thai population use tiger amulet, but we think this is very strong thing and very unique. And when we look at the leak, we found that the reason why people use the tiger amulet because they believe that it will help protect them. It gives like a supernatural power. So that when they're doing something that's quite dangerous, for example, like a taxi driver, they would prefer to have like a tiger amulet with them, just to make them feel safe. And then when we look also like when we go to like the shops and others, in Thailand you find that if you go to, for example, like at the temple, you might be able to find a tiger amulet from there, and the price would be different. If like it's from the real natural dead tiger, then it's more expensive, but the cheap ones can be. But as if they like the tigers from the farms have been made as the amulet, but it's been blessed by the monk, then it's also considered something that is sacred as well. So there's a different source of it. And then when we look at like who's involved in here, so actors, monks is one, the target, or the consumer who is between like 30 to 60 years old. And then we also learned that for the tourists, when they come, the tour guide would force the tourists, or maybe try convince them to buy the tiger amulet, for example, at the temple or the amulet mall, for example. And then we think what might be possible instead of like try to change the monks. So maybe we target the tourists instead and see what we can do with that, and also like the tourism sector, the tour operator.
Thanks, Dara. So yeah, there were some really interesting findings there, particularly around the role of monks and how they're encouraging people to buy these products, very, very hard sell, and the tourist agencies who organise these tours. And a lot of that is to do with the business model. So the expectation that actually to get a living wage for the tourist the agencies, it's expected that the guides will be getting a commission at each point where you go shopping. So where there's the biggest profit, which is when you're buying these amulets, obviously they've got a built-in incentive to make sure more and more people buy the amulets. So, you know, some very interesting things that we really need to explore. And actually, when we get to the research bit, you will see we had a huge list of research needs. But I'll just get May to report on your bits, which is on pangolin.
Yeah. So my group choose pangolin. So pangolin is kind of like a hot animal now that traffic a lot in the world. The first one is from the lead one. So it's simply just disconnect from the people to the dead animal that's already dead. So if they don't use it or if they don't eat that one, somebody else will eat. So they have like no emotion about that. Then they have lack of knowledge, so they don't know about the value of that animal, or they just don't have the information from other people, so they just kind of use that product anyway. From value to the intention, so it's about culture. So it's very strong that they have the belief in the scales that is help there, they help, or in the so it's like kind of traditional medicine, and because of that, so some people would buy that for their family as a show their love, and also the people who receive that gift also have like kind of hard to say no to use that. So it's a family reserve, and the anxiety of them to use that product like the scales of the pangolins, because I think because they think it's good for their health, so they worry about their health issue. Then the status that they want to show, for example, to impress their boss. So to impress the boss, or to just kind of to bring like kind of like the meat is something special, and another thing is to show their wealth, that they are rich. They want to eat something new and something expensive, that they show their wealth. Then the diffusion of responsibility, that they see that just a piece of meat or a piece of scale. So it doesn't matter that there's a lot of other pangolins out there. Then literally from intention to action, that they can buy that product or use that product. That just the availability, so it's easy to get. Maybe in China or in Vietnam, it's still very easy to buy the pangolin scale or the meat. Because it's a traditional medicine, so the doctor, the traditional doctor, still recommend that it's good for the health, so they buy it. And there's no substitution product to replace that scales into something else. And the last one is no clear rules about the ban to use that or not. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, May. So lots and lots of elements to the pangolin, which need a lot more thought, I think. So could we move, do we have those slides? Yeah, okay, great. Do you want to?
I certainly can. I haven't seen these slides before, so let's see what we've got. So we spent most of the session this afternoon actually just identifying quite a long list of research needs across the three products that the groups are focusing on. And you know, once we started that exercise, we realised that we could probably have gone on for some time, which is, I guess, both a positive and an indication of what's still out there to be done. So tiger amulets, it seems like there's quite a need to do a bit more sophisticated segmentation work in order to characterise the difference in sort of motivations and demand characteristics of different segments. one of the clear things that Sarah just mentioned is there's a really interesting role here for sort of secondary audiences. So I think when we're thinking about demand reduction, often we sort of gravitate straight to the consumer. But there are other players at the sort of at the demand-ish end of the supply chain that are really having quite an important role here. So as we mentioned, with the Tiger Amulets, we identified monks and tourist touts who are both quite critical in sort of pushing and doing that hard sell, particularly on Chinese tourists as they travel around the Southeast Asia region. As I think is common across the exercises we've all done today, a need for better data, good quality baseline data, consistent data across, or consistent formats of data across regions and studies and so on, so that we can really start to build up a much clearer picture of what's going on. And also, one of the things mentioned was around understanding people's propensity to buy, and to some extent this sort of emerges in the segmentation research, but among people that haven't necessarily bought it, what are the characteristics and the sort of demographic variables that might actually lead to higher propensity to buy, and can we sort of nip that in the bud and try and focus a bit more on prevention in this case, particularly as of course Tiger Amulets is the kind of thing that you buy once, or maybe a few times for gifts and so on, but it's not like a regular purchase. What else have we got? So a bit of a need for being a bit more specific and targeted about the behaviours we actually want to address. So of course, reducing the purchase of Tiger Amulets is to some extent a specific action, but actually within that there will be many other sort of micro behaviours. And as I said, that's partly about identifying who that's with respect to, whether it's monks, whether it's tourist agencies, whether it's individual consumers, whether it's a particular demographic. But there will be discrete and quite specific actions that we might do better to focus on one at a time rather than trying to tackle the whole issue in one hit. And the first stage of that is really sort of just mapping out the various behaviours and sort of touch points that sit within that. Again, just to echo something that was mentioned previously about the sort of meta review, there is of course quite a bit of good evidence out there, but it's not super coherent, it's not been sort of pulled together in a particularly coherent way. So reviewing that existing evidence and just doing that data-based research is a very important first step. And then also feeding off the presentation I gave this morning around the idea of sort of priming more pro-social behaviour through religious commitments and prompts. We felt that was a particularly interesting idea to explore here, given that there's a bit of a religious connotation anyway. So can we try and break that unhealthy connection there between monks and the sale of these goods, and actually try and turn that into a bit of a positive? On the pangolin, again, I think this is a good practice generally when running behaviour change campaigns, but we thought there was a need to identify where the low-hanging fruit is, because there's quite a lot of different forms of consumption of pangolin, whether that's meat scales and scales for a variety of reasons even within that. So, you know, which are the audiences where we might actually shift the dial? What are the situations and particular behaviours where we might actually have a bit of an opportunity there to make an impact, so that we can then learn with a bit of a start easy, essentially learn from that, and then gradually build up towards some more challenging behaviours. Again, sort of repeating myself here, but likewise, just as with the Tiger work, there's a need to review existing evidence and really build that into a sort of coherent meta piece. And also, there's some discussion around understanding the trafficking routes. It seems like there's still a bit of a need to explore that in more detail. Again, further segmentation, so there's quite a few distinct behaviours here. Some of it's meat consumption, some of it's TCM, some of it's jewellery, and all of those things have got some very different motivations, drivers, barriers, touch points, and so on associated with them. So segmenting that and understanding that is quite important. And finally, I mean, again, this is quite a broad piece, but I think there's a need to move away from just focusing on values and attitudes, of course, but actually thinking about that value-action gap and what are the other sort of bottlenecks in that change process. So it might be thinking around, well, rather than just pushing pro-wildlife values onto people, actually are there sort of situational things we can shift. So again, sort of going back to the shark fin soup example, thinking about defaults in restaurants and weddings, that sort of thing, to build the enabling context to help people actually act on their values and act on their intentions. And then finally on the shark fin. So again, a great need for a slightly more sophisticated behaviour mapping exercise to identify where those key touch points are. You know, weddings and such is one of those obvious ones, but there will be other ones as well, particularly when you think about other players such as restaurateurs and so on, not just the end consumers. And that speaks to the next point as well, around understanding the supply chain in a bit more detail. The wedding example we felt was a really clear nice sort of study in waiting, really. If we could somehow get some restaurateurs on board and actually flip the default so that rather than requiring consumers to proactively opt out, that was the default, that we think could be a really powerful intervention and quite a simple one, albeit, of course, not necessarily easy to change, given that there's quite high profit margins on this stuff for restaurants. One important point that was mentioned is that, and has already been mentioned, is that a lot of shark fin consumption is in fact legal. So there's perhaps a need for a quite an in-depth piece on the economic value of the legal shark fin trade to understand that better. And then finally, so another sort of nice detail there is around when we're actually developing campaigns, we don't really know to a great extent what kind of messages and what kind of messengers would be most effective with this issue. Again, another nice challenge actually that came up was that whilst this conference is very much focusing on demand side, we shouldn't forget supply side drivers. And actually, I think there's a slight tendency to associate demand side interventions with behavioural science, the kind of stuff we've been talking about for the last few days, and then to associate supply side solutions with more sort of enforcement type regime. But of course, that's not, that would be a false dichotomy, and we could just as equally apply some of these more innovative behavioural solutions to supply issues, particularly thinking about like whistleblowing or anti-poaching measures and so on, and vice versa, think about regulatory issues with respect to demand side as well. So that's mostly where we got. So we felt that case studies and such didn't seem to fit quite so well because ultimately we were talking about a sort of discrete sort of theoretical aspect of behaviour change. So we sort of focused mostly on the research gaps itself. Any questions on that?
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Value action gap. So any questions for the group or any additions from the people who were in that group? Okay, I have Nora.
I think some of the researches here don't necessarily have to be primary research, meaning you do a new research, but some of them can be like reanalysis of existing data, like the target segments, trying to identify the drivers for specific target segments like jewelry, etc., gifting. Actually, we have, based on the data that we have gathered from our current researches, we have done some reanalysis so that we can get like specific segments who say they bought it for jewelry, and then try to find out what are the drivers, etc. So I think some of them you can just do with reanalysis of the existing research data that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really nice point, and it's always good to get as much value as we can out of existing data. And my sense is there is quite a lot out there of mixed caliber and of mixed method, but absolutely worth mining that for all we can.
Okay, anybody else?
I might have to throw the microphone to Jeremy. Oh, next. Okay.
Just a quick question in terms of all the sort of barriers to not consuming shark fin soup at weddings. I thought that was a really interesting example. And as there are so many barriers in the way to actually do that action of not consuming fish soup, is it any way of identifying which of those gaps it is to target or should be most valuable, impactful to target first?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So it's not always obvious, to be honest, but I think the nice thing about this kind of framework about thinking about the value action gap is you can identify within the sort of intuitive sort of causal chain of behaviour change. You update people's awareness and values, and then they intend to behave, and then they behave. There will be points in that where, by thinking through that systematically, there's like a really obvious blockage. And if that's the case, then you should probably work on that. And I think the mistake we tend to make is that we assume, as conservationists and sustainability professionals, that in order to get more sustainable behaviour, we should push harder on the values. And if it's not getting through, well, let's just push even harder. Let's just really get people to care about this stuff. But of course, that is, as I think is unconscious behaviour reveals, that is often not a limiting factor. And it's a useful starting point. Often that does help. But once you've got to the point where awareness is actually fairly high already and values are already sort of in line, and by the way, I'm not sure if we're at that point yet with many of these behaviours, but once you do get to that point and you're still not achieving your goal, then you really should be looking at, well, what are the other barriers? Are there some practical issues going on here, inconvenience, or big sort of cost motivations that are going against you, those sorts of things, and you can redirect your attention.
So just a final point on that, I think what we were helped with to some extent in the group was that Chitra is WWF Malaysia and has done several years of work on this and has done other campaigns, and so she kind of came in with we have tried the campaign approach and we know it hasn't worked. So in a sense, it was a good one for us because it didn't mean everybody thought, well, if you just did a campaign, we'd raise the issue, we'd raise the profile, and things would change. We sort of had that kind of in the bag. And it also helped us because we could focus actually quite quickly. We could see where the biggest value action gap was happening, if you like. And that was actually probably in our favour. It did make it a good one to probe into in quite some depth. Would you agree with that, Chitra? Do you want to add anything?
Hi. Thanks a lot for the question. So we spent an entire the whole of 2016 running it's called the Makin Malak campaign. So basically, it was about going all out and just getting public pledges, and we were aiming for 1 million pledges of Malaysians to say they will not consume shark fin soup, and that was like 6 months of society coming and saying, yeah, I'll sign the pledge, but if people serve it, I'll still eat it. So we came out of the campaign, after 1 year, we came out of the campaign and said, look, we did not add any value to the Malaysian public because awareness was already high, because we knew that when we started the campaign, because there's always been a lot of this, ad hoc communication around shark fin. It's a very popular topic, very easy to market. So that's why we thought getting 1 million pledges is going to be no biggie. It's going to be really easy because people know the issues. So we came out and saying we didn't add any value. People know all about it, but they don't. That does not translate to action. People don't want to sign a pledge, and they don't want to stop eating. So we already knew that campaigning alone and creating awareness and changing people's value was not enough. It did not translate to actual action of reducing. And for us, at the end of the day, once we realized that people were aware who wanted to do something, the actual block was the restaurants, because restaurants refused to allow people to want to do something. They were like, no, it's our profit margin, you don't touch it. We want our profit. So yeah, so for me, I think that's where we want to really tackle the issue as well.
One final thought is that this is not just about developing more effective campaigns and interventions, although that's obviously largely what it's about. It's also a massive measurement issue, because if what you're measuring is a change in values, and we know that values do not necessarily correlate to actions, then you're kind of missing the point of it. You could go out and believing you're having a great impact all the time, and ultimately, unfortunately, not be. So it's about designing interventions to shift behaviour, but also measuring behaviour wherever we can.
Okay, thanks. That's a great segue to the next group who talked about measurement. So they're going to tell us how they would measure those tricky stuff, I think. So you sent me some slides, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to warm up for Alex, who is our designated lead. But I just wanted to, I guess we didn't go through. I just wanted to say some of the things, first of all, that we're focusing on, and then kind of segue into what Alex was talking about. So, I mean, again, what we were thinking about was how do you measure behaviors, really? I think one of the challenges that kind of has come up repeatedly here is that attitudes and values don't necessarily drive behaviors. They can be affected through a whole bunch of different factors, in particular situational factors that kind of can be driven by automatic thinking. So just, I'm going to list kind of 4 or 5 of the things we talked about very briefly, and then I'm going to put it on to Alex. So one of the things that we talked about was the idea of using kind of privatizing the context in which people are engaging in the survey in order to kind of get them to answer more honestly. If we're worried about survey response and kind of that kind of response bias, privatizing can be very helpful. Another method which we kind of discussed in a bit of detail and kind of shared some of the war stories around was the list experiment, which has been done quite a bit now in conservation at this point. We talked a lot about the value of thinking about observation, but online and offline, and we talked about, for example, digital listening and stuff like that. We talked about using the implicit association test, which takes advantage of kind of identifying people's implicit associations with particular things, in this case animals, or even it could be in relation to a particular consumption behavior. We talked about social norms, both in terms of getting a sense of people's beliefs around what's acceptable in society, but also as kind of what I think, I really like the word you used, this kind of idea of a Bayesian truth here, by asking people like what other people do, kind of getting a sense of what they really think themselves. And then finally we talked about randomized control trials, which I think is maybe hopefully the direction that the field is going in, even if it's kind of slowly after kind of, I think it'll take a bit of time to get there. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Alex, who really went into some of it.
Okay, let me grab this clicker. So going to talk through a couple of case studies relatively rapidly. Some resources, and when we talk about research need, actually what we realised afterwards, we were mostly talking about what are the next steps, what are the things that we would like to see in this area of measurement. So starting with the case of the Chi campaign in Vietnam, I think quite a few people will be familiar with this one. There's this idea of this ad campaign which kind of talks about sort of an identity piece, kind of real men don't need this, don't need a big lump of keratin. They make their own success and all this kind of related stuff. But I don't want to focus too much on the interventions, right? We're here to talk about measurement. So let's think about the measurement. So there's some real positives to this, I think. And one of the key ones was this idea that they captured baseline data. I think the reason I want to bring that up is because it tells you something important about what we can use measurement for. Measurement is not solely for purposes of evaluation. It can also be extremely useful in terms of telling us where we should be focusing, what is driving current behaviour, who is engaging this behaviour, and that allows us then to develop interventions in response to that, which hopefully can be a little bit more targeted and therefore a little bit more impactful. So the first positive about kind of capturing baseline data, some of the guys who were involved with this also talked a little bit, so that their measurement involved some self-report, so survey data. They talked a little bit about how sort of some new approaches to that, so not just sort of asking, did you or didn't you, which I think can lead to some, let's say, some misleading answers for various different reasons. People don't feel very comfortable telling you they did the naughty thing. People may sort of intentionally misinterpret your question in order to pretend they didn't do the naughty thing, and then various other responses. So some questions, for example, about whether people in your social circle would do this. It kind of takes the focus off you as the respondent a little bit and moves on to someone else. Interesting, actually, I've seen another thing a couple of years ago in Africa where they were looking at, they were asking people to kind of fill out a questionnaire and think about financial behaviours. And at the end they said, hey, so did you find this survey easy to understand? And people kind of rate it from 1 to 5. And then they say, do you think other people would find this survey easy to understand? And I think that's really neat, because it's quite hard for you to yourself say, yeah, I didn't have a clue what you were talking about, and now I feel like a fool. But it's a little bit easier for me to be like, yeah, it's not that I didn't understand, it's just that in general I think people might find this a little bit difficult to understand. So kind of thinking about these kind of clever ways to get around it. But what's next? So we talk about positives, but what's next from this? So looking at this baseline data is great, but we're still looking at self-report. And I think Toby quite well illustrated some of the challenges around that. So how do we move from self-report to observational data in this field where we're often talking about illicit behaviours, where we do not have direct access? So we talked about another case study, which we believe took place in the DRC, which was about looking at an ivory market stall. So there's a market stall that's selling ivory, and the way that this observation, was that they set up another stall next to that stall, so saying pencils or some other licit product, and they just used that as an observation point. I just tracked who's coming to the store, how many sales they're making, what kind of products they're selling, when are their times, this sort of thing. And there's been lots of other work in the ivory market in particular, whether it's kind of popping into markets on regular bases and checking on levels of consumption. The advantage to something like this is that it's single point long term, which gives you a slightly more kind of rich data set around that specific store. And the main thing, the positive about this, the reason I want to bring it up is because at that point you're tracking actual behaviors, you're tracking actual sales. So you're kind of cutting through this layer of obfuscation, which comes from asking people about stuff. You're just seeing what people actually do. And although that can seem, that we're going very, very detailed, very micro, one stall versus all this kind of, I can get survey data for thousands and thousands of people. But if we believe there is this kind of values action gap, and I think the research suggests that we should believe that, it might be that having a few data sources which are in-person actual behavior might still be at least as valuable as that big kind of self-reported stuff. So what's next? So there's one thing that this actually raises is how do we start measuring at the micro level rather than the macro level? And one of the reasons that we would do that. So in my mind, when I see something like this, I get very excited because I'm sort of a field experiment fanatic, and this gives me ideas for field experiments, right? Because you can start imagining, okay, we look at a few markets in the country that have ivory stalls. We say we're going to intervene in certain localities and not intervene in other localities, and we're going to use market stall data to track whether we think we're having an impact on actual sales. Now, if you're looking at the macro level, if you're looking at seizure data for a country, for example, you can't get to that kind of causality. You can't start to see, okay, the specific thing I did has made a difference in this particular locality, and therefore I have reasonable cause to believe that it's what I did that's causing that change. You can't get that so much when you're looking at kind of macro level, seizure data or kind of willingness to pay. And so that gives us a lot more, can give us again much more rich data in terms of whether the specific actions that we are taking in response to these problems are making an impact, are making a change. And then another question that we raised was this idea of, can we work with online markets to do something a little bit similar, but actually at a much larger scale? So working with online markets to see transaction data, to link that to IP addresses, to see if we can do something around geographies within that, localities within country, whether things are happening between country, and then using that kind of information to help us generate more targeted insights, more targeted data that can that hopefully give us a better sense of whether what we're trying is working or not. So a couple of case studies there. We talked about tools or resources. So if you're thinking about measurement, where do you go? So there's a few things. We've kind of suggested kind of three. I've got three things here, but I think we very much felt that we're open to further suggestions. So one was the SBCC guide from a little while back, which is kind of freely available, and I think is a really great primer that's dedicated to this particular area, and therefore is quite tailored in a way that I think makes it really useful. We also wanted to share a book by Rachel Glenister, Running Randomized Evaluations, a Practical Guide, which I think is quite good. I've been told Jamie's a big fan at breaking some of these what seems quite a black box of this sort of world of scientific evaluation into a bit more manageable, practical steps. In a similar vein, a few years ago, we published Tesla and Adapt. That is admittedly aimed primarily at a public sector context. There's a couple of things in it which I think are useful. So firstly, it walks through some of the classic reasons why people are a bit nervous about doing a field experiment. I think that's well worth checking out to see if that's some of the reasons maybe you're less interested in this, or where you worry that partners, donors, colleagues might be less keen to get involved in this kind of approach. And it also breaks down the steps of running a field experiment into about 9 different phases, which gives you a sense of the level of detail that we've afforded to all of them. But as I say, I mean, I think one of the things we said is that we're certainly looking for those suggestions in terms of available resources that people might have used that tell them more about, measurement methodologies, whether it's how to write a good survey, what are common pitfalls, all this kind of stuff, which I think could be quite useful. So, some actions and commitments. So I've got 5 things here. This is non-exhaustive, but I think the stuff that we kind of felt was well worth raising once again. So firstly, this idea about getting the basics right. So I think of this in terms of like baking in evaluation. So starting by doing some kind of baseline data collection, starting by figuring out what the measurable outcome that you are going to be seeking during your project is going to be at the end, so that you're working to, so A, that you select a good one, and B, that you work towards that outcome right from the start. Also, a point was raised, which I think is a really interesting one, which is about how do we make sure that our interventions in this space are ethical, particularly as we start to take on more from the kind of social science approaches to this sort of stuff, well, which is coming from the academic literature, right? And academics will tell you that they go through quite complicated ethical processes to make sure that what they're doing is on the level. So how do we make sure that we give credence to that we have some sort of thinking around that, whilst also at the same time making sure that it's appropriate for this slightly different setting. So there's a real balancing act there. And then his final point, which I've sort of made a little bit already, but about targeting. So the best way for us to be able to be more effective in our evaluation is if we scope down quite a lot in terms of who we want to do what and how we're going to measure that. I strongly believe that will make the interventions more effective because they can become more tailored, and it also makes evaluation just leagues easier. Another one, looking for opportunities to observe real behaviours. So the ivory market stall example is one. Sonia's work on genital cutting and looking for sort of, I don't know if this is quite the right term, but I suppose commensurate behaviours, so this idea that at the same time someone does behaviour A, they also do behaviour B. Another example of this that I've heard is people who go out in the jungle to harvest wild meat. If they get paid for it, sometimes they'll donate some of their pay to to the temple. And so whether there are other things where, can we observe the actual behaviour that we're interested in? And if we can't, can we at least observe some other actual behaviour that we think might be linked? So in order to get to this, of course, it often is about mapping out what those behaviours are. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. This point has been now made a couple of times, so I feel like we're all on the same page with it, but making our data open source, sharing the data, and I think also really important, not just sharing the outputs, but also sharing a little bit about the inputs. What is the way that you collected this data? How did you collect it? What questions did you ask? These things matter quite a lot, I think, and we can definitely serve to learn from each other's experiences in doing so in order to be more effective. And then, hopefully, the idea is then to build on, as has already been raised, these kind of shared measurement methods. There's two parts to this. So firstly, the idea of, hey, let's find out what best practice is, and then let's use that. But also this idea that if we're measuring the same thing, we start to be able to build up kind of continuous data over the course of time. And that can be quite helpful in seeing kind of how the market is changing, what's happening, and how things are moving as time marches on. So to go to fourth point here, this idea of regular evaluation rather than one-off. So this was raised, this was quite interesting to me, was this idea that, if we're looking at longer term programs, sometimes the market totally changes in the time that we're working there. So we talk about in Vietnam with rhino horn, sort of 10 years ago it became that it was the cure for cancer, 5 years ago it became that it was the cure for libido. I don't know what it's going to become next year, but it does suggest that there are changes happening even as we're working within these things. So it's really important that we don't rest on our laurels, I think, in terms of the data collection that we're doing, in terms of the evaluation and measurement that we're doing, that we need to continue to update and learn more about how these behaviours and processes are changing to ensure that we're kind of speaking to the right people about the right things. And then finally, we've talked a little bit on a kind of ongoing basis about this idea about categorizing data. So this idea that we can sometimes collect really rich qualitative data, say from in-person interviews. And I think, I have a kind of more qualitative background, so I'm always one to trumpet the benefits of this in terms of understanding the mindset of the people involved, in terms of trying to understand their motivations, but more than anything, just trying to get a sense of the environment in which they're making those decisions. What is it like being them, basically? It's kind of getting in the shoes of the other person. However, we must also recognize that people misremember things. People will tell us things that they think we want to hear, and do other things that's going to, and sometimes people just do not know, in truth, the thing that caused them to take the action they did. One example I'll give of this, which I always love giving, a lab experiment, where I show you two pictures of faces, kind of face A and face B, and I say, which of these do you think is more attractive? You have a look at both the faces, and you're like, no, okay, well, I think I'm going for that one. So I'm going to go for face A. I think face A is the more attractive face. I say, great, and then we go off and we do another unrelated task, and then about half an hour later, I come back and say, oh, so remember we did this face thing? I just wanted to ask, when you chose face B, why is it that you thought face B was more attractive? Now, you didn't choose face B, you chose face A. But it's surprisingly common that people will then give a lengthy explanation for why they chose face B. Oh yeah, I'm not that keen on beards, I really like blue eyes, like all these things. And it's one of those things is that people may not be aware that they are now post hoc rationalizing an answer for a choice they did not in fact give. But I think it's a very useful insight into self-report, into qualitative data, into asking people why. Because the truth is that we're very good at coming up with a why when people ask. It might have basically no bearing whatsoever on what actually led to our decision. So thinking about, so I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that we should be recognizing the different types of data we can get, qualitative, quantitative, self-report, observational or behavioral data, and knowing the different limitations. Some of these are going to be easier to find, but they're going to tell us certain things and not other things. Some of these are maybe going to obfuscate the truth. And provided we can go into this kind of eyes open, I think that we can hopefully kind of build a bigger data set, which is more helpful.
No, I mean that's great. I mean you turned our reflections into a lecture almost. That's fantastic. I mean, in an amazing way. I mean, I think so that was really good. Great. So, I mean, if so, one thing to say is if you guys have questions about some of the stuff that we covered in the activity kind of analysis.
Any questions? Gail?
Just a point of process. I mean, I think clearly there was so much rich stuff coming out of that group, and it's just a huge set of issues to unpack. It would be really useful to continue the conversation. So I really hope as part of the commitments, certainly we can continue to engage you and any others that are really interested in this in sort of maybe even just one more call. It would be really good to kind of figure out, okay, here's some threads that we want to investigate further and actually perhaps even submit some research proposal funding for or something like that. It would be really good to build up this insight into methods. It's very valuable.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions? I'm conscious of time, but...
I can confirm that
Okay,
I'm conscious of
thank you.
time is a good way to not invite one question.
So just one final thing to say is that in the next session, I think we're going to be talking about the decision tree, and there will be an opportunity to kind of summarize some of the methods that we discussed in the sessions as well. So we have an opportunity.
Did you have another slide? Oh, you did. Okay. Okay. So we have one more group. Do you know what the group is? I'm just going to see if we're like with us, or are you asleep, or what's the one group that's not presented yet? Gateways. Okay, you won, but there's no chocolate. Okay.
Come on. So should I start or should I?
You can start, and I'll look for the slides.
All right, so we discussed quite a bit about gateway behaviors, and as you know, we were discussing a particular set of behaviors that are a precursor to the actual impactful behaviors that all of you are really working on. So what we did was we spent an hour yesterday, an hour today trying to step back and create a kind of a journey map of if we are at point B, and I'm actually waiting for the slide to come up to show you visually a very attractive diagram that Gail put together in last minute. I think it becomes clearer once you see that visual diagram. How, if you are at point X, how do you go back in the life of the person to point A, and then try to understand the influencers of those that behavior. There you go. And so all of you are basically working at this end of the spectrum and trying to hit that one with your regulatory, informational, and social exchange kind of mechanisms. But what Gail had this idea, and by the way, I was a lead, but the real person behind the action was Gail. She's the idea person behind all this. So basically, we were trying to go step back and say, can we actually journey back in the life of the person who is at that stage, but go back and see where it all started. And so that was the gateway behavior. What is it? What influences it? Who are the influencers? Can we actually step back and try to target this end of the spectrum, where the behaviors are less sticky than the one at this end of the spectrum? And so basically that's what we spent our time. Yesterday we picked on 2 examples. One group worked on elephant ivory. What are the gateway? So a person. So what is the end point for ivory? I was not involved in that group, so.
So we try to recognise that you can have somebody that first perhaps receives something like ivory earrings as a gift, and for them it's something that they are delighted to receive, it's something that they treasure, that reflects a lot of respect to them from the gift giver and enables them to show face in community. And because of these positive reinforcements of the fact that they now own something that's ivory, they go out and they see maybe an ivory bangle in the market. This is a very simplistic kind of example, but to illustrate the purpose. They see an ivory bangle and now all of a sudden they're an active ivory consumer because they buy the bangle and it's $200 and they've spent a lot of money on it. Again, they don't get any sort of negative consequence to this. Instead, they get something like social confirmation, social gratification. It really reinforces the fact that actually, it's great to be an ivory consumer. So through this process, and we think it probably varies in terms of the duration of sort of the first quite passive consumption behaviour through to something a lot more active where you actually really desire ivory. And it's very difficult at that point to apply behaviour change communications. It's much more involved, it costs a lot more money, you've got to be a lot more creative with approaches that you adopt. I don't know whether this is true for all of the commodities and situations that we work with, but I think it would be really important to research this because you could save a lot of money potentially by targeting things a bit more up this side of this graphic. So it's a very simplistic illustration. I'm sure we could pick a lot of holes in it, particularly the behavioural scientists in the room are probably quite unhappy right now. But I think it's worth looking into, and we tried to do that in the group. It wasn't easy, but I think we all sort of agreed it was something important to continue to look into a little bit more.
Thanks. And the other group, our group focused on tiger products, and so the endpoint is that, and we focused on Vietnam as a culture. So Vietnamese culture has a tradition of consuming all kinds of products based on tiger's body parts, skin, claws, fangs, bones, so on and so forth. And then we focused on the tiger bones. And Don, where is he? He very eloquently described how he was introduced to by his father. He's standing right there. By his father on mixing tiger bones with whiskey, and that's a tradition of drinking whiskey in tiger bone in Vietnam, and how he experienced very dramatic effects on himself. But eventually he learned to realize that this was not a good idea. It was putting tigers in danger, so on and so forth. But that was the entry point for him. Once he was introduced to using tiger parts, he would then go on to, well, thank God he did not, but that's where the journey begins, and it ends with consuming all kinds of tiger body parts. Similarly, for women, they are introduced to that tiger bones as part of medicinal benefit for arthritic pain or bones pain. And so then they get used to it and consuming other body parts. So that was a fascinating, insightful discussion that we had yesterday. And then we followed up on the same under Gail's guidance to the case studies, information needs, and tools that we could think of as a plan of action for the future. I can do it the traditional way. Oh, okay. And so in the informational needs section, we came up with a list, and And actually, we came up with, we identified commitments, who will do what. And again, it was useful to have some kind of then timeline and responsibilities assigned, not just a discussion that starts here and like Las Vegas, it ends here. It does not. It's going to move on for the future. And so, basic question was picking on certain commodities and the forms in which they are consumed, which are those, who are the consumers who tend to consume those, and then can we actually map the evolution of these consumers and then create, to use the layman marketing term, segments or consumer archetypes as they both at point A to point X. And of course, we do realize that people who are already at the other end of the spectrum are the ones who are, let's say, older generation. They're more difficult to change. They may be addressed through communication and regulation. But can we highlight people and target them who are at the starting stages of the journey? And so that was one of the main issues that we really discussed on who are they, how do you evolve, what are the influencers. We didn't realize that can we actually do one case study and then we focused on tiger bones and skins in China. And Traffic and WWF have taken the responsibility of creating this exemplar journey map of kinds of individuals who evolve into consuming tiger bones and skins. And that is going to be a brave responsibility that Heather and Gail have undertaken, will become a template for others to follow, other organizations to undertake, and they are going to make this available. By when can we expect this, Gail? And 2020. That's not fair. Anyway, she expects things like in 3 months from us, but and then buys herself quite a few years. So by 2020, we're going to see a beautiful visual representation of a journey map of what kind of consumers, what their archetypes evolve as they consume tiger bones and skins in China. And then, of course, come up with solutions of how eventually could we target them to kind of fix the problem so that prevention takes place. We also discussed, are there existing models, the behavioral models that can help us understand along the way that already exist, that can help, and I think some of the discussion that's coming up of the behavioral science could be useful here, that actually has already thought about such issues in other fields. And can we then borrow that knowledge, bring it to our fields to actually fill in the informational gaps to, I think, for you guys to actually create that first visual representation. Something that was enforced upon me was to create, to draw upon knowledge from other fields, and so how heroin addiction is the end point and how it starts with simple behaviors like smoking. Can we actually create a journey map? The literature already exists, so it's a matter of reviewing that literature, and so we are going to, me and my team are going to take the responsibility of creating, drawing this together, summarizing the literature and making it available to Traffic. And the way to represent this is in the form of, as a part of the MOOC content, the online course content, which we have been tasked upon to do in the near future. And then finally, in terms of tools, do you want to speak about that again a bit?
So behavioural journey mapping is quite an established process in some other fields of application for behavioural science. So we thought it'd be good to start to learn how to do it properly, because I know of it, I don't know how to do it. So it's good because it will show sort of enabling factors and influences and trigger things, and there's all sorts of jargon around it, but as a visualisation process it can be extremely useful because it sort of actually enables you to identify where can you invest a really targeted effort. So if you've only got a limited amount of resources, it helps you to actually map and be clear about what the theory and what the situation shows about where to invest your resources. So I know there are some in the room, Jamie, you have done this before. So it'd be good to kind of think as a community, how can we share that experience perhaps together and learn from that?
Is that it? Yeah, and that's a summary of the responsibilities assigned to us. I think we have already highlighted that. So the Vietnam group was supposed to do that, but they're still waiting for your visualization to actually arrive at it. So what they agreed to work on after 2020 is they will actually take the knowledge, the information that Traffic and WWF will create and convert that into designing an actual intervention to address the same issues that will be highlighted in the journey map, which will become an example of then trying it out with availability of funding to apply that in the real world and test it and see if it works. Any questions for us?
You've got a terrible typo in the second line.
I did not type.
Okay.
Oh,
I think
US,
that's
you
about
don't
female
S,
celebrities, not about drugs.
Okay. Any questions for them, or any specific other ideas that could be linked with gateway behaviours? Follow up with this community. Okay. There's one question over here.
Thank you for that. Going back to these non-sticky areas and really helping them to recollect how they started with that type of behavior and got a meaning around that. What would be the ultimate result that you think you'll get by doing that? Because I think I work mostly on social inclusion, gender equality in relation to climate change. And one of the ways we try to elucidate all the power differences, demographic segmentation is also by doing that. Ultimately, what we find is that yes, that makes people definitely aware, but then does that really lead to action? So is there something that you're also thinking that there should be maybe one more step where you actually help them do the recollection and there's something that will help them to lead to action?
Well, I thought this was a tough issue. The one that you are highlighting is even more difficult to address because it has the ingrained cultural traditions, patriarchy, right, and all those issues playing a role. Do I have an answer? No. Our basic assumption is if we go after something that is more malleable and less sticky, simple doable behaviors, let's start with those because it's easier to enact and maybe then try out for the more difficult ones. So I'm not an expert, but maybe there are areas of targeting behaviors that predate those behaviors that you are talking about, which are doable and maybe I have more reception by the same audience earlier in their life that are worth targeting.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the Gateway group? Okay, thank you. I think you can give yourselves a big round of applause. So that's the four deep dive groups, yeah? And there's a number of commitments and a number of ideas that are coming out of that, which when we wrap up later, we can hear what's going to happen to those. Who's feeling cold? I am too, that's so weird, they must have built the AC. Who's feeling no energy? Oh, no one will. Now, we've just had a whole day talking about honesty and cheating, and so now, you know, I'm listening as we're going along now. This is giving me tips for facilitation. So we still have a session to go where, as Jamie mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the toolkit and the MOOC. Do you remember what MOOC is?
Massive
Open online. Something course. At least you're kind of honest. Yeah. Okay. So, but before we do that, I'm thinking that we need to move around a bit, to be honest. And I can't go to a coffee break yet. So, I don't know. What I'm thinking is that you should all stand up. That's what I'm thinking. At least.
I'm going to.
Hang on.